That first cup of coffee, the one you reach for within minutes of opening your eyes, feels like the thing that saves your morning. But I need to tell you something that might be hard to hear. That cup is quietly sabotaging your brain before your day has even really started. By drinking caffeine the moment you wake up, you're blocking an essential chemical cleanup process your brain hasn't finished yet, and you're throwing your deep sleep cycles into a kind of chaos that repeats itself, quietly, night after night. You're not simply tired. What you're actually dealing with is a slow, chronic neurological fatigue that builds up because your brain never gets the deep, restorative sleep it's supposed to get. Your morning ritual is, in a very real sense, a chemical battlefield, and your sleep cycle loses that battle every single day. We flood our system with a stimulant before our brain has even finished its own natural overnight reset, and the result shows up later as fragmented sleep, middle of the night waking, and a recovery process that never quite completes itself. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly why this happens and the specific, simple adjustment that lets you work with your biology instead of constantly fighting against it. I want to say clearly right at the start that I'm not here to tell you to give up coffee. I drink it myself. This entire conversation is about timing, not elimination, and by the end of this video, I think you'll see that the fix here is genuinely one of the simplest changes we've ever discussed on this channel, even though the mechanism behind it took me a full video to properly explain. Here's the part that surprises almost everyone. You think that first cup is boosting your productivity for the day ahead. What it's actually doing is delaying your body's natural need for sleep for the next 24 hours, pushing that need later and later into a cycle that never quite resets properly. This chemical interference is the hidden reason so many people can sleep a full 8 hours and still wake up feeling like they barely slept at all. Adjusting when you drink your coffee isn't just a minor lifestyle tweak. Once you understand the mechanism, you'll see it's one of the most direct things you can do to protect your brain's long-term health. Let's start with the actual chemistry, because once you understand this one molecule, everything else in this video will click into place. Throughout every hour you're awake, a molecule called adenosine steadily builds up in your brain. Think of adenosine as an internal pressure gauge, quietly measuring exactly how long you've been awake and how much your brain genuinely needs to rest. The longer you're awake, the higher that gauge climbs and the more that rising pressure pushes you toward feeling sleepy. By the time you go to bed at night, after being awake for 16 or 17 hours, that adenosine pressure is high enough to help pull you down into deep, genuinely restorative sleep. While you sleep, your brain does something remarkable. It actively clears that accumulated adenosine, essentially resetting the gauge back down towards zero. So you can wake up with a fresh, low level of sleep pressure and start the whole cycle over again. Here's the critical detail almost nobody understands. That clearing process isn't instantly finished the moment your eyes open. It continues for a while after you wake up, gradually finishing its work over the first hour or so of your morning, well after your alarm has already gone off. Caffeine works by attaching itself to the exact same receptors that adenosine is supposed to bind to. It doesn't remove adenosine or lower the pressure. It simply blocks your brain from being able to sense that pressure at all, essentially covering up the gauge rather than actually resetting it. Picture a warning light on a car's dashboard, one designed to tell you when the engine genuinely needs attention. Caffeine doesn't fix whatever triggered that light. It simply puts a piece of tape over the light itself, so you stop seeing the warning even though the underlying issue it was pointing to hasn't gone anywhere. When you drink coffee the instant you wake up, before that natural clearing process has finished its work, you're not giving your brain a fresh start. You're covering up a job that's still partway done, artificially telling your brain you don't feel tired while a meaningful amount of leftover adenosine pressure is still sitting there, unresolved, quietly waiting to reassert itself later. This is exactly why that first sip feels like such an immediate lift. It's not creating new energy. It's masking a physiological signal that was already in the process of resolving itself naturally, and interrupting that process has consequences that show up later in the day and later that night in ways most people never trace back to their coffee timing at all. Now let's talk about what's happening with your hormones during this exact same window, because there's a second layer to this that makes the timing even more significant. We've discussed before in our episode on morning blood pressure that your body naturally releases a wave of cortisol shortly after waking, sometimes called the cortisol awakening response. This isn't a malfunction, it's your body's own built-in alarm system designed specifically to wake you up, sharpen your focus, and get you moving, entirely without any external stimulant required. This cortisol wave typically peaks within the first 30 to 45 minutes after you open your eyes. Here's where the conflict happens. If you drink caffeine right into the middle of that natural cortisol peak, you're not adding a gentle boost on top of an already rising system. You're layering one stimulant response directly on top of another, creating what's essentially a double stress response moving through your nervous system at the exact same time. Your adrenal glands are already ramping up cortisol production on their own schedule, and caffeine adds an additional separate stimulant signal right in that same narrow window. Over time, doing this every single morning trains your body to associate that early waking window with an artificially intensified stress response. This can gradually shift your circadian rhythm, the internal clock that governs your entire sleep-wake cycle, by several hours over weeks and months. Your body starts expecting that combined cortisol and caffeine hit as part of what waking up means, which can make the transition into wakefulness feel increasingly dependent on caffeine and can push your natural evening wind down later and later as your entire internal clock gradually drifts out of its original alignment. There's an important connection here to something we've discussed at length throughout this series. Cortisol doesn't just affect your alertness and your blood pressure, it also raises blood glucose, part of the same mechanism behind the dawn phenomenon we've talked about when discussing morning glucose numbers. Stacking caffeine directly on top of that natural cortisol peak means you're compounding a glucose-raising signal with a second stimulant at the exact same time your body is already managing its own morning hormonal surge. For anyone managing insulin resistance, this is one more reason that 90-minute delay we're about to discuss carries benefits that extend well beyond sleep alone. Let's follow this pattern forward into the rest of your day, because the story doesn't end with your morning cup. Caffeine's effects typically last somewhere between 4 and 6 hours, though this varies from person to person based on genetics and how quickly your liver processes it. But remember that adenosine you masked earlier in the morning never actually went away. It kept accumulating underneath the caffeine the entire time, and now it's had several additional hours to build up even further completely unaddressed. When the caffeine finally wears off, usually sometime in the early afternoon, all of that accumulated adenosine pressure hits you essentially at once, producing that sudden heavy wave of fatigue most people know as the midday crash. Almost everyone responds to this crash the exact same way. They reach for a second cup of coffee, or a soda, or an energy drink, specifically to push through that afternoon slump. This is precisely where the real damage to your nighttime sleep begins. Caffeine has a half-life of roughly 5 to 6 hours, meaning that a cup consumed at 2 in the afternoon still has a meaningful amount of active caffeine circulating in your system well past 8 o'clock that evening. That lingering caffeine directly interferes with your body's production of melatonin, the hormone specifically responsible for signaling to your brain that it's time to wind down and prepare for sleep. So the afternoon coffee that felt necessary to survive the crash caused by your morning coffee ends up sabotaging the very sleep that would have prevented needing either cup in the first place. This creates what's genuinely a self-reinforcing cycle, one that can run quietly for years without anyone noticing the loop itself. Morning caffeine masks the tail end of overnight adenosine clearing and compounds your natural cortisol peak. That caffeine wears off by early afternoon, releasing a backlog of adenosine that was never actually addressed. A second cup masks that afternoon crash, but lingers long enough to blunt your melatonin production that night. Your sleep that follows is lighter and less restorative than it should be, leaving you with a higher starting adenosine level the very next morning, making that first cup feel even more necessary than it did the day before. Every single piece of this cycle looks completely reasonable in isolation. It's only when you trace the whole loop from morning to night and back to morning again that the pattern becomes clear. Now let's talk about what happens once you actually do fall asleep that night, because this is genuinely the most important part of this entire conversation, and it's the piece almost nobody explains clearly. Sleep isn't one uniform state. It moves through distinct stages throughout the night, and the deepest of these, often called stage 3 sleep or slow wave sleep, is where your brain does its most critical restorative work, clearing out metabolic waste products, consolidating memories, and supporting the kind of genuine physical and neurological recovery that simply cannot happen during lighter stages of sleep. This is the sleep that actually leaves you feeling refreshed the next morning, as opposed to just technically unconscious for 8 hours. Even small amounts of caffeine remaining in your system at bedtime measurably reduce how much time you spend in this deep, restorative stage. Your brain, even while you're asleep, still has caffeine molecules sitting on those adenosine receptors, continuing to interfere with your natural sleep architecture. The result is that your brain stays in a subtly lighter state of arousal throughout the night, even though you're technically unconscious and would tell anyone, including yourself, that you were asleep the entire time. This is exactly why so many people can sleep a full 8 hours and still wake up feeling foggy, unrested, and low on energy. The total number of hours was there, but the depth and quality of those hours was quietly compromised the entire time by chemistry that was still active in the background. Think of it like the difference between 8 hours spent fully submerged in a deep, still pool versus 8 hours spent treading water near the surface the entire time. From the outside, both look like 8 hours in the water. From the inside, only one of them actually gave your body genuine rest, and the other left you working the entire time without ever quite realizing it, simply because you never fully went under. Let me tell you about Diane. Diane is 68 years old, spent over 3 decades working as a travel agent, and had been a committed coffee drinker for nearly her entire adult life, cup in hand within minutes of getting out of bed, every single morning without exception. A habit she'd carried through decades of early flights and jet-lagged mornings during her career. For years, she'd also been dealing with a frustrating pattern of feeling exhausted despite consistently getting a full 8 hours in bed each night. Diane's daughter had given her a wearable sleep tracker as a gift, mostly out of curiosity more than any specific concern. What the data revealed surprised her considerably. Night after night, her total sleep time looked completely normal, right around 8 hours, but her percentage of deep sleep was consistently far lower than the tracker's general benchmark, night after night, with very little variation. She brought the data to her appointment, printed out and highlighted, exactly the kind of concrete evidence I always appreciate seeing from a patient. When Diane described her daily routine to me in detail, the pattern became fairly clear rather quickly. She was drinking her first cup within 10 minutes of waking, right in the middle of her natural cortisol peak, and she typically had a second cup around 2 or 3 in the afternoon to get through what she'd always assumed was simply an unavoidable midday slump. Both of those habits, stacked together, were working directly against the deep sleep her tracker was struggling to detect each night. Diane made 2 specific changes. She started waiting roughly 90 minutes after waking before having her first coffee, allowing that natural adenosine clearing process and her cortisol peak to move through their own initial phase without caffeine layered directly on top. And she pushed her one remaining cup earlier in the day, making sure she had nothing containing caffeine after roughly noon, giving her body a full 12 or more hours to clear it completely before bedtime. Within about 3 weeks, her sleep tracker showed a meaningfully higher percentage of deep sleep most nights, even though her total hours in bed hadn't changed at all. She told me something that captured this entire conversation perfectly. I always thought coffee was helping me get through my day. It turns out it was quietly stealing from the exact thing that would have made my days easier in the first place. She also mentioned that she no longer felt like she needed that second afternoon cup nearly as often, since her improved deep sleep was naturally carrying her through the day with more genuine energy than the caffeine ever had. She joked that after 30 years of booking other people's trips around time zones, she'd finally figured out how to properly align her own internal clock. So let's walk through exactly how to apply this in your own life, starting tomorrow morning. First, and this is the single most important change in this entire video, delay your first cup of coffee by roughly 90 minutes after waking. This gives your body's natural adenosine clearing process and your natural cortisol awakening response the time they need to move through their own initial phase without an external stimulant interrupting that process. You're not giving up coffee, you're simply letting your own biology finish a job it's already doing before you add anything on top of it. If 90 minutes feels like a big jump from where you are now, even pushing your first cup back by 30 minutes at a time over a couple of weeks moves you in the right direction without requiring an uncomfortable, abrupt change. Second, use that 90-minute window productively rather than simply waiting around feeling foggy. This is exactly the time to get natural sunlight exposure, ideally by stepping outside for even just 10 or 15 minutes shortly after waking. Morning light exposure directly signals your circadian clock, helping regulate the timing of your entire sleep-wake cycle and reinforcing your natural cortisol rhythm rather than working against it. Combining delayed caffeine with early sunlight exposure is a genuinely powerful pairing, since each one reinforces the other's effect on your internal clock, and neither one costs anything or requires any special equipment. Third, if you rehydrate before that first cup, the way we discussed in our video on morning blood pressure, you're addressing overnight fluid loss at the same time, which also tends to ease that first hour grogginess many people are specifically trying to caffeinate their way through in the first place. A full glass of water combined with sunlight and a little movement often does more to genuinely wake you up during that window than most people expect. Fourth, set a firm cutoff time for your last caffeine of the day, ideally no later than early afternoon, roughly 8 to 10 hours before your usual bedtime. Given caffeine's 5 to 6 hour half-life, this gives your body enough time to clear the majority of it before it can meaningfully interfere with your melatonin production that evening. If you go to bed around 10, that generally means nothing containing caffeine after about 2 in the afternoon. Fifth, if you find yourself consistently needing that second afternoon cup to survive a midday crash, treat that crash itself as useful information rather than simply pushing through it with more caffeine. A significant afternoon slump is often a direct signal that your morning caffeine timing and the adenosine rebound it produced is driving the very fatigue you're trying to caffeinate your way out of. Adjusting your morning timing first often reduces or even eliminates the severity of that afternoon crash entirely. The way it eventually did for Diane, breaking the self-reinforcing cycle we just walked through, rather than continuing to feed it. And sixth, give this adjustment a genuine 2 to 3 week trial before judging whether it's working for you. Your body has likely been running on this same caffeine cortisol pattern for years, sometimes decades, and it takes a little time for your circadian rhythm to fully readjust to a new, more aligned schedule. If you have access to a sleep tracker, the way Diane did, use it to watch your deep sleep percentage specifically over those weeks, rather than relying purely on how rested you feel each morning, since that feeling can take longer to catch up to what's actually improving underneath it. And if you don't have a tracker, a simple daily note about how refreshed you feel upon waking, kept over those same weeks, can reveal a similar trend even without any device at all. I do want to add an important note of caution here. If you currently rely on caffeine to manage symptoms of an underlying medical condition, or if you're taking any medication that interacts with caffeine, please talk with your doctor before making significant changes to your intake or timing. Some people also experience genuine withdrawal symptoms, including headaches, when reducing or shifting their caffeine intake, and easing into this change gradually, rather than stopping abruptly, is often a more comfortable way to adjust. As always, nothing in this video replaces a conversation with your physician about your specific health situation. And if you're managing any diagnosed sleep disorder, this information is meant to complement your treatment, not substitute for it. This also isn't a recommendation to eliminate caffeine altogether if you enjoy it and tolerate it well. It's specifically about the timing, which is a change most people find far easier to sustain than giving up coffee entirely. If this video helped you understand your own morning ritual a little differently, share it with someone who reaches for coffee the instant their eyes open every single day, the same way Diane always had. Sometimes the smallest shift in timing, not the coffee itself, is the piece that finally lets your body do the deep, restorative work it's been trying to do all along. I also want to take a moment here because this video represents something I've been building toward across this entire series, going back many episodes now. We've talked about blood sugar, circulation, nerve health, blood pressure, and memory, and sleep genuinely sits underneath nearly all of it. A poor night's sleep raises cortisol, which raises blood glucose the next day. It affects your circulation, your appetite hormones, and even the clarity of your thinking in ways that touch almost every single topic we've explored together on this channel. If there's one habit worth protecting above almost everything else we've discussed, it's genuinely this one, and I hope today's conversation gives you a real, practical place to start. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.